G'day! In this lesson, we will implement security using the authorization and permission systems available in ABP Framework. The ABP Framework provides an authorization system based on the ASP.NET Core's authorization infrastructure. One major feature added on top of the standard authorization infrastructure is the permission system, which allows to define permissions with the ability to enable and disable per role, user or client. A permission must have a unique name, a string. The best way is to define it as a constant, so we can reuse this permission name later. Let's open the Bookstore Permissions class inside the application.contracts project in the permissions folder and change the contents with the following code. This is a hierarchical way of defining permission names. For example, create book permission name is defined as bookstore.books.create. ABP doesn't force us to use this structure, but we'll use it anyway because it's useful and easy to understand. We should always define permissions before using them. Let's open the Bookstore Permissions Definition Provider class inside the application.contracts project in the permissions folder and change the contents with the following code. This class defines a permission group to group permissions on the UI. There are 4 permissions inside this group: create, edit, and delete. They are the children of the bookstore permissions.books.default permission. A child permission can only be selected if the parent is selected. Finally, we will edit the localization file en.json underneath the location/bookstore folder of the domain.shared project to define the localization keys used in these permissions, which we created in the previous step. As previously mentioned, localization key names are arbitrary and not a forcing rule, but we prefer to use the convention as we've just done. Once we define the permissions, we can see them on the permissions management modal. Let's run the application. We then navigate to Administration, Identity, Roles page, select the permissions action from the admin role to open the permissions management modal. We grant the permissions we want and save the modal. If we ran the DB Migrator console application, then these permissions would have been granted to the admin role automatically. But since we have a database which is already seeded, we would have to drop the database and run it again, so we won't do that in this step. Now that we have defined the permissions, we can use them to authorize the book management. Let's open the book app service and add the following code to the constructor. The base CRUD app service automatically uses these permissions on the CRUD operation. This makes the application service secure, but also makes the HTTP API secure, since the service is automatically used as a HTTP API, as explained before in the Creating the Server-Side lesson. We'll also see the way of using declarative authorization using the authorize attribute later when developing the authors management functionality. Let's open the books.razor file in the Blazor project and add an authorize attribute just after the at page directive using the following code. We have just added an attribute which prevents the user from entering this page if the current user hasn't logged in or hasn't been given. If an unauthorized user tries to access this page, then the user will be redirected to the login page. The book management page has a new book, edit, and delete action buttons for each book. We should hide these buttons or actions if the current user hasn't been granted the related permission. The base ABP CRUD PageBase class already has necessary functionality for these kind of operations. Let's add the following code block at the end of the books.razor file. This is the cool part about Blazor. We are writing C# code inside the HTML page. No JavaScript needed. The base ABP CRUD PageBase class automatically checks these permissions on the related operations. It also defines the given properties for us if we need to check them manually. The variable hasCreatePermission is true if the current user has been given the permission to create the entity. hasUpdatePermission is true if the current user has permission to edit or update the entity. hasDeletePermission is true if the current user has permission to delete the entity. While adding the C# code into a code block is fine for small code parts, it is suggested to use the code behind approach to develop more maintainable code base when the code block becomes longer. We will use this approach when we create the UI for the authors. Let's wrap the new book button by an if block which uses the hasCreatePermission variable. The entity action component defines a required policy attribute to conditionally show the action based on the user's permissions. We will update the entity actions section with the following code, which includes the relevant policy for each action. Let's run the application and test the permissions. We will remove a book-related permission from the admin role to see the related button/action disappears from the UI. ABB Framework caches the permissions of the current user on the client side. So when you change a permission for yourself, you will need to manually refresh the page for it to take effect. If you don't refresh and try and use the prohibited action, you will get a HTTP 403 response from the server. Changing a permission for a role or user immediately is available on the server side, so this cache system doesn't cause any security problem. Even though we have secured all the layers of the book management page, it is still visible on the main menu of the application. We should hide the menu item if the current user has no permission to access the books page. Let's open the Bookstore Menu Contributor class in the Blazor project, and we will replace the menu items we added previously with the following code. We can see that the books menu item code block is wrapped with a isGradedAsync method to check if the books.default permission is granted to the user. Only then will the books menu item will be available to the user. Let's run the application. As we can see, if we are not logged into the application, we cannot see the books menu item. In this lesson, we implemented security using the authorization and permission systems available in the ABP framework. Join me in the next lesson to build the domain layer for authors.